The thunderstorm loomed ominously over the Arizona territory, as Nathaniel Thornton urged his tired horse along the muddy trail toward Chloride, each step sending a jolt of pain through his twisted left leg. The year was 1884, and the mining town ahead promised shelter from the impending deluge. Though Nate, as most folks called him, knew his reception might be as cold as the rain that had begun to pelt his weathered hat. His horse, a sturdy dapple gray named Maverick, snorted against the wind. "Almost there, old friend," Nate murmured, patting the animal's neck as lightning split the sky. The thunder that followed startled even Maverick, who had seen his share of storms in their 3 years together. The horse reared slightly, and Nate winced as he used his good leg to steady himself in the saddle. Nate had come to Arizona territory seeking a fresh start after the war, and a mining accident had left him with a permanent limp. At 32, he'd learned to live with the pain and the sideways glances that followed him from town to town. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a deputy, and lately as a gold prospector, though fortune had yet to smile upon him. The rain intensified as they approached the swollen creek that separated him from Chloride. In the fading daylight, he spotted something alarming: a wagon overturned in the rapidly rising waters, its contents scattered along the bank and into the creek itself. Worse still, there appeared to be movement in the water, someone struggling against the current. Without hesitation, Nate spurred Maverick forward, dismounting awkwardly when they reached the bank. His limp was pronounced as he stumbled toward the creek's edge, but he paid it no mind. Someone was drowning, and he was the only soul around to help. "Hold on," he shouted above the storm, shedding his heavy coat and gun belt. The figure in the water, a woman, he now realized was being swept downstream, her soaked dress weighing her down as she fought to keep her head above water. Nate plunged into the frigid creek, gritting his teeth against the cold and the pain that shot through his bad leg. The current pulled at him immediately, threatening to drag him under, but he was a strong swimmer despite his disability. Years of compensating for his weaker left side had strengthened his arms and right leg considerably. The woman had stopped struggling, a dangerous sign. With powerful strokes, Nate closed the distance between them, reaching her just as she slipped beneath the surface. He dove, his hand finding fabric, and pulled upward with all his might. They broke the surface together, the woman limp in his arms. Nate turned onto his back, holding her against his chest as he kicked with his good leg toward the shore. The current fought him every inch of the way, but Nate's determination was stronger. His lungs burned and his leg throbbed, yet he refused to surrender to the creek's hungry pull. After what seemed like an eternity, his feet found purchase on the muddy bank. With the last of his strength, he dragged the woman onto solid ground and collapsed beside her. She wasn't breathing. "No, you don't," Nate growled, rolling her onto her side. He pounded her back firmly, desperately trying to expel the water from her lungs. "Breathe, damn it." The woman suddenly convulsed, coughing violently as water spewed from her mouth. Nate supported her until the coughing subsided, relief washing over him as she took shuddering breaths. When she finally opened her eyes, they were a startling shade of green that caught Nate off guard. She stared up at him, confusion giving way to comprehension as she realized what had happened. You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the ordeal. "Just happened to be passing by," Nate replied, helping her sit up. "Name's Nathaniel Thornton. Most folks call me Nate." "Hannah," she said, coughing again. "Hannah Zimmerman." She studied him as he retrieved his coat from where he'd dropped it and draped it over her shoulders. Her gaze lingered on his leg as he limped back to her side. "We need to get you somewhere warm," Nate said, looking toward the town. "Can you stand?" Hannah tried to rise but collapsed immediately. "My ankle," she winced. I think it's broken. Nate glanced at her wagon, half submerged in the rising creek. Your things, they don't matter, she interrupted. Nothing valuable except my father's watch, and that's here. She patted a small pocket sewn into her bodice. Thunder crashed overhead, and Nate knew they couldn't linger. I'll come back for what can be saved once you're safe, he promised. For now, I'm afraid you'll have to ride with me. He whistled for Maverick, who'd retreated from the creek but stayed nearby. The horse approached cautiously, and Nate soothed him before helping Hannah to her feet. She leaned heavily against him, and he couldn't help noticing how small she felt in his arms. I don't know if I can, she began, eyeing the saddle uncertainly. I'll help you, Nate assured her. With careful movements, he lifted her onto Maverick's back despite the protest from his bad leg. He mounted behind her, securing her against his chest with one arm while taking the reins with his free hand. As they set off toward Chloride, Hannah rested her head against his shoulder. You're the strongest man I've ever known, she murmured, her words nearly lost in the storm. Your leg. Yet you carried me. Nate said nothing, unaccustomed to praise. He'd long ago accepted that his strength would always be questioned due to his limp. To have it recognized instead of doubted stirred something in him he thought he'd buried years ago. The lights of Chloride appeared through the rain, a welcome sight after the harrowing rescue. The mining town was small but boasted a decent hotel and a doctor, both of which Hannah would need. They arrived at the town's only hotel, the Silver Summit, as night fully descended. Nate dismounted first, then carefully helped Hannah down. She couldn't put weight on her injured ankle, so without asking permission, he swept her into his arms. I can hop, she protested weakly. And risk hurting yourself worse. Nate shook his head. This is faster. The hotel lobby was warm and mercifully empty save for the proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Jenkins, who took one look at their bedraggled state and sprang into action. Land sakes, she exclaimed. What happened to you two? Wagon overturned in the creek, Nate explained briefly. Lady needs a doctor for her ankle, and we both need to get dry before pneumonia sets in. Mrs. Jenkins nodded briskly. Set her down on that settee. I'll send my boy for Doc Wilson and get some hot water brought up. She eyed Hannah's soaked dress. And some dry clothes for the lady. My daughter's about your size, miss. Nate carefully deposited Hannah on the indicated furniture. I need to see to my horse, he said, and then I'll try to retrieve what I can from the lady's wagon. Hannah caught his hand as he turned to leave. Please be careful, she said. The creek was rising fast. It's not worth risking your life again. Their eyes held for a moment longer than necessary before Nate nodded and limped back into the rain. True to Hannah's fears, the creek had risen considerably in the short time since their escape. Maverick was stabled, and Nate borrowed a lantern from the livery to light his way back to the accident site. Most of the wagon was now underwater, but some items had washed onto the bank. He gathered what he could: a small trunk, a carpet bag that had snagged on a bush, and a framed photograph protected by its glass. By the time he returned to the hotel, soaked to the bone for the second time that evening, Dr. Wilson had already examined Hannah. Her ankle was sprained, not broken, and she'd been given a room on the ground floor to avoid stairs. Mrs. Jenkins intercepted Nate at the door. You're dripping all over my clean floor, Mr. Thornton, she said, though there was no real admonishment in her tone. The lady's in room 3. Doc says she'll be fine with rest. I've put you in room 4 and there's hot water waiting. I suggest you use it before you catch your death. Nate nodded gratefully. I found some of her things, he said, indicating the items he'd rescued. I'll have them taken to her room, Mrs. Jenkins promised. Now get yourself dry. After a hot bath that eased the ache in his leg and fresh clothes from his saddlebags, Nate felt almost human again. He hesitated outside Hannah's door, unsure if she'd be awake or if she'd welcome his intrusion. Before he could decide, the door opened and Mrs. Jenkins emerged with an empty tray. "Ah, there you are," she said. "Miss Zimmerman was just asking after you. Go on in." Hannah was propped up in bed, her ankle bandaged and elevated on a pillow. Her hair, now dry, was a rich auburn that caught the lamplight, and she'd been dressed in a borrowed nightgown with a shawl for modesty. She smiled when she saw him, and Nate was struck by how pretty she was now that she wasn't half drowned. "Mr. Thornton," she greeted him. "I was beginning to worry you'd been swept away." "It takes more than a creak to get rid of me," Nate replied, remaining near the door. "How's the ankle?" "Dr. Wilson says I'm lucky," she said. "A bad sprain, but it should heal fully in a few weeks, thanks to you." Nate shrugged uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Hannah said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most men I know wouldn't have risked themselves for a stranger, especially not with—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking to his leg. "My limp," Nate finished for her. "It's all right, I'm used to people noticing." "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to be rude. I just meant that what you did was even more remarkable." "War injury," he offered, surprising himself with the admission. He rarely spoke of it. "Sharpsburg, then made worse in a mine collapse 5 years back." Hannah's eyes widened. "You fought in the war. For which side?" "Union," Nate replied. "Though out here it hardly matters anymore." "My father fought as well," Hannah said softly. "He didn't come home." An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Nate remembered the photograph he'd salvaged. "I found this," he said, producing the framed picture from where Mrs. Jenkins had placed it with Hannah's other belongings. "Thought it might be important." Hannah took it from him, her fingers trembling slightly as she wiped away the remaining moisture from the glass. The photograph showed a stern-faced man in a Union officer's uniform standing beside a smiling woman and a younger version of Hannah. "My parents," she confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "This is all I have left of them. Thank you for saving it." "I wish I could have saved more," Nate said, genuinely regretful. "You saved me," Hannah replied simply. "That's far more than I could have hoped for." She set the photograph on the bedside table. "May I ask where you were headed before our paths crossed?" "Nowhere in particular," Nate admitted. "I've been prospecting up north, but the claim didn't pan out. Thought I'd try my luck around chloride." "You're a prospector, then?" "Among other things," Nate said with a slight smile. "I've been a cowhand, a deputy, even tried my hand at bounty hunting for a spell. None of it stuck." "A man of many talents," Hannah observed. "And now a hero as well." Nate felt heat rise in his face. "Hardly that. Just happened to be in the right place." "Well, I'm grateful you were," Hannah said. She stifled a yawn, and Nate realized how exhausted she must be after her ordeal. "I should let you rest," he said, moving toward the door. "Is there anyone I should notify about your accident? Family waiting for you somewhere?" Hannah shook her head. "No, there's no one. I was headed to Prescott to take a position as a schoolteacher, but—" She gestured helplessly at her ankle. "I fear I've missed my opportunity." "Prescott's not going anywhere," Nate assured her. "I'm sure they'll hold the position once they hear what happened." "Perhaps," Hannah said, though she didn't sound convinced. "In any case, I can't travel for some time." "Then you'll stay here until you're healed," Nate said firmly. "We'll figure out the rest later." Hannah looked as though she wanted to object but was too tired to argue. "Thank you again, Mr. Thornton," she said instead. "Nate," he corrected her. "After pulling you from a creek, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Nate," she repeated with a small smile. "Good night, then." "Good night, Miss Zimmerman." "Hannah," she insisted. "After being pulled from a creek, I think we can dispense with formalities." Nate's laugh surprised them both. "Fair enough. Good night, Hannah." As he closed her door behind him, Nate found himself wondering about the twist of fate that had brought them together. He'd saved people before it came with the territory and the places he'd lived and worked, but something about Hannah Zimmerman intrigued him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He dismissed the thought as he entered his own room. She was a pretty woman in distress, nothing more. Once her ankle healed, she'd be on her way to Prescott, and he'd continue his solitary existence. That was how things worked for men like him. Yet as he lay in bed listening to the storm rage outside, Nate couldn't help but remember the way she'd looked at him, not with pity for his disability, but with genuine admiration for his strength. It was a novel experience, and one that followed him into his dreams. Morning arrived with clear skies and no trace of the previous night's tempest except for the mud on the streets and the still swollen creek. Nate rose early, as was his habit, and went to check on Maverick before breakfast. The horse had weathered the storm well and greeted him with a friendly nudge. "At least one of us had a restful night," Nate murmured, stroking the animal's neck. After ensuring Maverick had fresh hay and water, Nate made his way to the hotel's small dining room. It was nearly empty at this early hour, with only a couple of miners nursing coffee before their shift. Nate took a table near the window and ordered breakfast from the sleepy-eyed server. He was halfway through his eggs and biscuits when Hannah appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane that Dr. Wilson must have provided. She wore a simple blue dress that Nate guessed belonged to Mrs. Jenkins's daughter, her hair neatly pinned up. Despite the cane and her obvious discomfort, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that drew his attention. Nate stood automatically, wincing slightly as his stiff leg protested the sudden movement. "Good morning," he called, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Would you care to join me?" Hannah smiled and made her way slowly to his table. "Thank you," she said as he helped her into the chair. "I'm afraid I'm not very graceful at the moment." "You're doing better than I did when I first started using a cane," Nate told her, resuming his seat. "Kept forgetting I had it and nearly fell on my face more times than I care to admit." Hannah laughed, a bright sound that seemed to lighten the room. "That makes me feel better," she admitted. "Dr. Wilson says I should use it for at least 2 weeks. "Smart man," Nate commented. "Have you had breakfast?" Hannah shook her head. "I was just about to order." Nate signaled the server, who took Hannah's order for tea and porridge. When the girl had gone, Hannah turned her attention back to Nate. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said. "Yesterday was so chaotic, and I was hardly in my right mind after nearly drowning." "There's no need." "There is," Hannah interrupted gently. "You saved my life, Mr. Nate. I would be at the bottom of that creek if not for you." Nate shifted uncomfortably under her earnest gaze. "What were you doing traveling alone?" he asked, changing the subject. "It's not exactly safe, especially with the spring storms." "I had little choice," Hannah replied. "The stagecoach doesn't run to where I was staying, and hiring an escort was beyond my means. The wagon and mule were loaned to me by the family I was boarding with." "The mule," Nate said suddenly. "Did you see what happened to it after the wagon overturned?" Hannah's expression fell. "No, everything happened so quickly. The water rose so fast and the wagon tipped." She shuddered at the memory. "Do you think it drowned?" "Animals are often smarter than people when it comes to survival," Nate said, hoping to reassure her. "It might have broken free and made it to shore downstream." "I hope so," Hannah said. "It wasn't mine, but I'd hate to think it suffered because of me." "It wasn't because of you," Nate corrected her. "Accidents happen, especially in flash floods." Their conversation paused as Hannah's breakfast arrived. She ate delicately, though Nate could tell she was hungry. When she'd finished, she looked up to find him watching her. "What will you do now?" he asked. Hannah sighed. I need to wire the school board in Prescott and explain what's happened. I should also contact the Millers, the family who loaned me the wagon, and tell them about the accident. Her shoulders slumped slightly. And I need to find somewhere to stay until I can travel again. You're welcome to remain at the hotel, Nate suggested. It's comfortable enough. On a teacher's salary. Hannah shook her head ruefully. I can perhaps manage a few days, but not weeks. I'll need to find more affordable lodgings and perhaps some way to earn my keep while I heal. Nate considered this problem. Mrs. Jenkins might know of something. Chloride's not a large town, but there are decent folks here. I'll speak with her, Hannah agreed. But first, I should send those telegrams. Is there an office in town? At the general store, Nate confirmed. It's not far, but the walk might be challenging with your ankle. Hannah looked determined. I'll manage, or I could escort you, Nate offered. I need to visit the store myself. It was a lie, but he didn't want her struggling through the muddy streets alone. Relief flashed across Hannah's face before she schooled her features. I wouldn't want to impose, she said carefully. It's no imposition, Nate assured her. I'd welcome the company, in fact. After breakfast, they set out for the general store. The spring sun had begun to dry the worst of the mud, but the going was still difficult. Hannah moved slowly with her cane, and Nate adjusted his pace to match hers without comment. He was acutely aware of how frustrating it could be when others drew attention to one's limitations. The general store doubled as Chloride's post office and telegraph office. The proprietor, Samuel Parker, greeted them warmly as they entered. "Morning, folks," he called from behind the counter. "What can I do for you today?" "The lady needs to send some telegrams," Nate explained, "and I'm looking to resupply." He figured he might as well make his lie truth. "Telegraph operators just stepped out," Parker told them. "Should be back within the hour." "You're welcome to write out your messages while you wait, miss." Hannah nodded and took the proffered paper and pencil. While she composed her messages, Nate browsed the store's offerings. He selected a few necessities: coffee, beans, bacon, and then, on impulse, a small bottle of rose water that reminded him of his mother. "Courting Thornton?" Parker asked quietly with a knowing grin as he wrapped the purchase separately. "Just being neighborly," Nate replied firmly. "The lady had a rough time yesterday." "So I heard," Parker nodded. "Creek's dangerous this time of year. Mrs. Jenkins says you pulled her out yourself, bad leg and all." Nate stiffened. "My leg works well enough." Parker held up his hands placatingly. "Meant no offense." "It was a brave thing you did." Before Nate could respond, the bell above the door jangled as several men entered the store. They were miners by the look of them, with dirt-stained clothes and hard expressions. One of them, a tall man with a bushy red beard, spotted Hannah and nudged his companion. "Well, look here," he said, his voice carrying. "Fresh face in town, boys." Hannah glanced up, then quickly returned to her writing, her posture tense. Nate moved casually to stand between her and the newcomers, his hand resting on the counter near his holstered revolver. "Morning, gentlemen," Parker called, his tone pleasant but firm. "What can I help you with?" "Just some tobacco," the red-bearded man replied, approaching the counter. He looked Hannah over openly. "And maybe an introduction to the pretty lady." Hannah kept her eyes on her paper, her knuckles white around her pencil. "The lady's busy," Nate said quietly. Redbeard turned his attention to Nate, taking in his stance and the gun at his hip. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "You're that gimpy prospector who rode in last night, ain't you? Heard you were quite the hero." Nate said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "Come on, Russ," one of the other miners said. "Let's get our tobacco and go. Foreman's waiting." Red-beard Russ hesitated, then shrugged. "Another time, maybe," he said, tipping his hat mockingly toward Hannah before turning his attention to Parker. "2 plugs of your strongest." The tension in the store eased slightly as the miners conducted their business and left. Hannah released a breath she'd been holding and looked up at Nate gratefully. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Men like that are why I don't typically travel alone." "Men like that are all talk," Nate assured her, though he knew that wasn't always true. Parker here wouldn't have let things get out of hand in his store. "That's right," Parker agreed, though he looked relieved that the confrontation had passed without incident. "Russ Halley's got a big mouth, but he's harmless enough when sober. It's after payday you want to avoid him." Hannah nodded, though she didn't look convinced. She handed her completed telegrams to Parker. "For when the operator returns," she said. "How much will they cost?" After settling the bill for her telegrams and Nate's supplies, they left the store. The walk back to the hotel was quieter, Hannah seemingly lost in thought. "Don't let fellows like that worry you," Nate said eventually. "Most men in these parts are decent enough." "I know," Hannah sighed. "I've lived in the West my whole life. My father moved us to Colorado after the war, and after he died, I stayed on. I'm not naive about frontier towns and the men in them." "I didn't mean to suggest you were," Nate said quickly. Hannah smiled to show she took no offense. "I know that too. You've been nothing but kind since we met, Nate. A true gentleman." They reached the hotel, where Mrs. Jenkins was sweeping the porch despite her considerable girth. She paused her work to eye them curiously. "Out for a morning stroll, were you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she found this interesting indeed. "Sending telegrams," Hannah explained. "And Mr. Thornton was kind enough to escort me, given my ankle." Mrs. Jenkins murmured knowingly. "Miss Zimmerman, I've been thinking about your situation." "My Bessie, that's whose dress you're wearing, she's off in Tucson visiting her sister, so her room's empty. You're welcome to use it at a reduced rate until you're mobile again." Hannah's face lit up. "That's very generous of you, Mrs. Jenkins." "Well, we can't have you sleeping in the hotel proper for weeks, can we? Too expensive for a young lady on her own." Mrs. Jenkins winked at Nate. "Unless you've got other arrangements in mind." Nate felt heat creep up his neck. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said warningly. The older woman laughed. "Just teasing, Mr. Thornton. Don't get your hackles up." She turned back to Hannah. "The room's yours if you want it, dear. $3 a week, including breakfast." "That's more than fair," Hannah said gratefully. "Thank you." As they entered the hotel, Nate handed Hannah the small package he'd purchased at the store. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Just something to make your stay more comfortable," Nate said awkwardly. "After everything you've been through." Hannah unwrapped the paper to reveal the rose water. A genuine smile spread across her face as she uncorked it and inhaled the delicate scent. "This is lovely," she said. "But you didn't need to." "I wanted to," Nate interrupted. "Consider it a welcome to chloride gift." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Then Hannah carefully recorked the bottle and tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've been uncommonly kind to a stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," Nate pointed out. "Not after everything." Hannah considered this. "No, I suppose not. Friends, then." "Friends," Nate agreed, though a part of him wondered if that was all he wanted to be. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Hannah moved into Bessie Jenkins's room, a cozy space at the back of the hotel with its own entrance. Each morning, she and Nate would breakfast together in the hotel dining room, sharing stories of their lives. He learned that she was 26, had taught in a small Colorado mining town for 3 years, and had a passion for literature. She discovered his dry sense of humor, his knowledge of horse breeding, and his surprising talent for woodcarving. For his part, Nate found prospecting work in the hills around Chloride, returning each evening dusty but generally in good spirits. The work wasn't especially profitable, but it kept him busy and gave him purpose while he decided his next move. Hannah, meanwhile, had received responses to her telegrams. The school board in Prescott expressed regret about her accident but couldn't hold the position open indefinitely. They suggested she apply again when she was fully recovered. The Millers were understanding about the wagon and mule, particularly when Hannah promised to pay them back when she could. With her teaching prospects dimmed, Hannah took up Mrs. Jenkins's offer to help around the hotel in exchange for a further reduction in rent. Despite her injured ankle, she could manage light cleaning, mending, and bookkeeping, skills Mrs. Jenkins sorely needed but wouldn't admit to lacking. Nate often found himself lingering at the hotel longer than necessary, seeking out Hannah's company. He told himself it was simply because she was pleasant to talk to, different from the rough men he usually encountered in his work. But deep down, he recognized the growing attraction between them. One evening, about 2 weeks after the accident, Nate returned from the hills earlier than usual. He'd had a frustrating day, his prospecting yielding nothing of value, and his leg was paining him more than he cared to admit. Instead of going straight to his room, he found himself heading toward the hotel's small garden, a quiet spot where he sometimes went to ease the ache in his leg away from prying eyes. To his surprise, Hannah was already there, seated on a bench with her injured ankle propped on a cushioned stool. She was reading, the fading sunlight just enough to illuminate the pages. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps and smiled warmly. "You're back early," she observed, marking her place in the book. "Nothing worth staying for today," Nate replied, trying to hide his discomfort as he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. Hannah wasn't fooled. "Your leg is bothering you," she said. It wasn't a question. Nate started to deny it automatically, then sighed. "Yes," he admitted. "Some days are worse than others." Hannah nodded in understanding. "My ankle has been throbbing all afternoon. Dr. Wilson says the rain coming tomorrow is to blame. Changes in the air pressure affect injuries." "My pa used to say the same thing," Nate said. "Called his old war wound his weather predictor." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I received a letter today," Hannah said eventually, "from a friend in Denver. She says there's a teaching position available at her school for the fall term if I'm interested." Nate felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving. "Denver's a fine city," he said carefully. "Lots of opportunities there." "Yes," Hannah agreed. "And it would be nice to be near a friend again." She hesitated. "Though I've made new ones here." Their eyes met in the twilight, and Nate was struck by the warmth in her gaze. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Hannah leaned slightly into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Hannah," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "Yes," she whispered. Before he could speak again, the garden gate creaked open and Mrs. Jenkins's voice called out, "Miss Zimmerman, are you out here, dear? Supper's nearly ready." The moment broken, Hannah straightened and called back, "Yes, Mrs. Jenkins, I'll be right in." Nate stood and offered Hannah his hand. "May I escort you to supper?" he asked formally, trying to recapture some of the ease they'd shared a moment before. Hannah took his hand with a soft smile. "I'd like that," she said. "And perhaps afterward we could continue our conversation." "I'd like that," Nate echoed, relieved that whatever had sparked between them hadn't been imagined. Supper was a lively affair, with several new guests at the hotel providing fresh conversation. Hannah sat beside Nate, and he was acutely aware of her throughout the meal, the subtle scent of rosewater, the way she laughed at the traveling salesman's jokes, the occasional brush of her arm against his. After the meal, true to her word, Hannah suggested they return to the garden. The night had grown cooler, so Nate fetched a blanket for her from his room. They settled on the bench again, this time sitting closer together. "What were you going to say earlier?" Hannah asked. Before Mrs. Jenkins interrupted, Nate took a deep breath. "I was going to say that I've enjoyed getting to know you these past weeks, more than I expected to." "As have I," Hannah replied softly. "You're not like most men I've met, Nate." "Because of my leg?" he asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "No," Hannah said firmly. "Because of your character. You're kind without expecting praise, strong without needing to prove it, and gentle despite the hardships you faced." She placed her hand on his arm. "The fact that you've overcome your injury only speaks to your determination, but it's not what defines you to me." Nate covered her hand with his, marveling at how small it felt beneath his calloused palm. "I've spent so long being seen as less because of this limp," he admitted. "It's hard to believe someone might see past it." "I saw past it the moment you pulled me from that creek," Hannah said. "When I called you the strongest man I've ever known, I meant it, and not just physically." The sincerity in her voice broke something open inside Nate, a wall he'd built around himself over years of sideways glances and whispered comments. Before he could overthink it, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. Hannah stiffened in surprise for just a moment before returning the kiss, her hand moving from his arm to his shoulder. It was a sweet, tentative kiss, a question asked and answered in the most ancient of languages. When they parted, Nate searched her face for any sign of regret. Instead, he found a blushing smile that set his heart racing. "I've wanted to do that for days," he confessed. "I've wanted you to," Hannah replied. Nate caressed her cheek, still hardly believing this was happening. "What about Denver?" he asked, the question that had been gnawing at him. Hannah's smile faltered slightly. "It's a good opportunity," she said, "but I'm not sure it's what I want anymore." "What do you want?" Nate asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Time," she answered honestly. "Time to know my own heart. Time to see if what's growing between us is as real as it feels." Nate nodded, understanding. "I can give you time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Neither am I," Hannah assured him. "At least not for a while yet. Dr. Wilson says my ankle needs another week or two before I should travel any distance." "Then we have time," Nate said, drawing her closer beneath the blanket as the night air cooled around them. They stayed in the garden until the stars fully emerged, talking softly about everything and nothing. When the chill finally drove them inside, Nate walked Hannah to her door, stealing one more kiss before bidding her good night. As he limped back to his own room, Nate felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time since his injury, he didn't feel defined by his limitations. In Hannah's eyes, he was whole, strong, even, and that revelation was more precious than any gold he might find in the hills. The following weeks brought a deepening of their connection. Nate continued his prospecting, occasionally finding enough color to keep him going, but never the strike that would change his fortunes. Hannah's ankle improved steadily, and soon she was moving about with only occasional use of the cane. They took evening walks around Chloride, Nate proudly escorting Hannah past the curious eyes of the townspeople. Mrs. Jenkins watched their courtship with undisguised approval, often finding reasons to leave them alone together. Even Samuel Parker at the general store took to calling Hannah Mrs. Thornton when Nate was out of earshot, much to her embarrassment. The question of Denver hung between them, unresolved. Hannah had written to her friend expressing interest in the position but had not committed. As May turned to June, and her ankle healed completely, the decision could no longer be postponed. "I need to give Sarah an answer," Hannah said one evening as they sat on the hotel porch, watching a spectacular Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "The school needs to know if they should hold the position for me." Nate nodded, his expression carefully neutral despite the turmoil in his chest. "What are you thinking?" Hannah turned to face him directly. "I'm thinking that I came west to be a teacher because it was the respectable path for a woman alone. It's what my mother did before she married my father and what she always assumed I would do." She took his hand. "But I'm also thinking that I'm not alone anymore, or at least, I don't want to be." Hope bloomed in Nate's heart, but he tempered it with caution. "Hannah, I can't offer you much," he said honestly. "I've been scraping by for years. The gold I'm looking for might never appear." "Do you think I care about that?" Hannah asked. "I've lived simply all my life." "I don't need riches, Nate. You deserve better than a broken-down prospector with an uncertain future," he insisted. Hannah's eyes flashed. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't diminish yourself that way, not with me." She squeezed his hand. "The man who saved me from that creek, who's shown me nothing but kindness and respect, who looks at me like I'm something precious, that's who you are to me. Not your limp, not your profession, not your bank account." Nate was stunned into silence by her fierce defense. When he found his voice again, it was rough with emotion. "I love you," he said simply. "I never expected to feel this way again, but I do. I love you, Hannah Zimmerman." Hannah's face softened into a radiant smile. "And I love you, Nathaniel Thornton, which is why I've decided not to go to Denver." "Are you sure?" Nate asked, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "I'm sure about how I feel," Hannah replied. "The rest we can figure out together." She leaned forward and kissed him softly. "If that's what you want." "It's what I want more than anything," Nate assured her. An idea that had been forming in his mind over the past weeks suddenly crystallized. "What would you say to a partnership?" "What kind of partnership?" Hannah asked, her eyebrows raised. "A business one, for starters," Nate explained. "I've been thinking about the future. Prospecting is a young man's game, and my leg won't get any better with age. But chloride is growing, and it needs services for the miners and their families." "What are you suggesting?" "A boarding house," Nate said. "Mrs. Jenkins does well with the hotel, but it's expensive for long stays. A proper boarding house with reasonable rates would do good business. You could even offer lessons for the miners' children, not a formal school, but enough to give them a start." Hannah looked thoughtful. "That's actually not a bad idea," she said slowly, "but it would take capital to start." "I've been saving," Nate told her. "Not much, but enough for a down payment on a small place. And Samuel Parker mentioned that old man Guthrie's place at the edge of town is going up for sale now that he's moving to California to live with his daughter. It's a good-sized house with room for boarders." "You've given this a lot of thought," Hannah observed, a smile playing at her lips. "I've had reason to think about the future lately," Nate admitted. "A future that includes you if you'll have me." Hannah's eyes widened as she realized what he was implying. "Nate, are you asking what I think you're asking?" Nate shifted on the bench to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not doing this properly," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I don't have a ring yet," but he took a deep breath. "Hannah Zimmerman, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? I promise to love and cherish you for all my days, to work hard to give you the life you deserve, and to never forget how fortunate I am that creek brought us together." Tears welled in Hannah's eyes, but her smile was blinding. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Nathaniel Thornton, I will marry you." Nate pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and hope that filled his heart. When they parted, both breathless and laughing, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I may limp through life," he murmured, "but with you by my side, I've never felt stronger." "That's because you are strong," Hannah replied. "The strongest man I've ever known, and now the only man I'll ever love." Word of their engagement spread through Chloride with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By noon the next day, It seemed everyone knew that the limping prospector and the pretty schoolteacher he'd rescued from the creek were to be married. The news was generally met with approval, though Nate noticed a few disappointed looks from minors who'd harbored their own hopes regarding Hannah. Mrs. Jenkins was ecstatic, immediately offering the hotel's dining room for the wedding reception. Samuel Parker's wife, Eliza, promised to bake the finest wedding cake Chloride had ever seen. Even Dr. Wilson got involved, suggesting that the ceremony could take place in his large garden, which was the most well-tended spot in town. Amid the flurry of well wishes and offers of help, Nate and Hannah began to plan their future in earnest. They visited Old Man Guthrie's house and found it perfect for their needs, a 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms upstairs that could accommodate boarders and comfortable living quarters downstairs for themselves. The price was reasonable, as Guthrie was eager to join his daughter in San Francisco before the summer heat became unbearable. With Nate's savings and a small loan from the bank, approved with surprising speed after the banker's wife heard about their romantic story, they were able to secure the property. As June progressed, preparations for both the wedding and the boarding house moved forward. Nate worked tirelessly to ensure the house was in good repair, often returning to the hotel late in the evening with paint in his hair or sawdust on his clothes. Hannah, meanwhile, ordered linens, kitchenware, and other necessities from catalogs, working within their modest budget to create a home that would be both practical for boarders and comfortable for themselves. One evening, about 2 weeks before their wedding date, Nate returned to the hotel to find Hannah on the porch, a letter clutched in her hand and a troubled expression on her face. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, sitting beside her. "A letter from the school board in Denver," Hannah said, handing it to him. "They're offering me the position with a salary higher than I anticipated." Nate felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he scanned the letter. The offer was indeed generous, more than a teacher in Chloride could hope to earn. "This is a good opportunity," he said carefully, returning the letter to her. "It is," Hannah agreed, watching him closely. "In another life I would have been overjoyed to receive it. And in this life?" Nate asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Hannah smiled, the troubled look fading from her eyes. "In this life I have everything I want right here," she said, taking his hand. "I've already written to decline." Relief washed over Nate. "Are you sure?" "I would understand if," Hannah silenced him with a kiss. "I've never been more certain of anything," she assured him when they parted. "Our boarding house, our life together, that's my dream now." Nate pulled her close, overwhelmed by gratitude for whatever twist of fate had brought this remarkable woman into his life. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" he murmured against her hair. "Yes," Hannah laughed softly, "but I don't mind hearing it again." Their wedding day dawned clear and surprisingly mild for late June in Arizona territory. Dr. Wilson's garden was transformed with wildflowers and ribbons, courtesy of the ladies of Chloride who had taken Hannah under their wing. A small arbor constructed by Nate and several of the miners stood at one end of the garden, festooned with desert blooms. Nate stood beneath it, wearing his best suit newly brushed and with a fresh shirt purchased for the occasion. He leaned on his cane more heavily than usual, the result of a long night spent putting finishing touches on their new home, but he hardly felt the discomfort through his nervous excitement. Beside him stood Samuel Parker, who had agreed to be his best man despite knowing him for only a few months. The small gathering of guests, perhaps 30, in all turned as one when the fiddler began to play a traditional wedding march. Hannah appeared at the garden gate on the arm of Dr. Wilson, who had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. Her dress was simple but elegant, a pale blue that highlighted her auburn hair and fair skin. She carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers tied with a white ribbon, and her smile as she caught sight of Nate was radiant. Nate felt his breath catch in his throat. He had thought her beautiful from the first, even soaking wet and half drowned, but today she was transcendent. As she walked toward him, their eyes locked, and the rest of the world seemed to fall away. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, conducted by a circuit-riding preacher who had fortuitously arrived in Chloride the day before. When it came time to speak their vows, Nate's voice was steady and sure, his promise to love and cherish Hannah until death echoing his proposal, but somehow even more profound in this formal setting. Hannah's vows were equally moving, her clear voice carrying easily to the assembled guests as she pledged herself to Nate. In sickness and in health, through good fortune and bad, with gratitude for the strength and kindness that first drew me to you. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nate kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of their friends and neighbors. In that moment, all the hardships he had endured, the war, the mining accident, the years of struggle and loneliness seemed worth it, for they had led him to this day and this woman. The celebration that followed at the Silver Summit Hotel was joyous and surprisingly refined for a mining town. Mrs. Jenkins had outdone herself with the decorations, and the food was plentiful and well prepared. Eliza Parker's wedding cake was indeed a triumph, 3 tiers of white cake with buttercream frosting that drew admiring comments from everyone. As evening approached and the party showed no signs of winding down, Nate found a quiet moment with his new wife. "Are you ready to see our home, Mrs. Thornton?" he asked softly. Hannah's eyes lit up at her new name. "Lead the way, Mr. Thornton," she replied, slipping her arm through his. They made their goodbyes, enduring the good-natured teasing that traditionally accompanied newlyweds' departure, and set out for their new home at the edge of town. The walk was pleasant in the cooling evening air, and they took their time, savoring the transition from their separate lives to their shared future. When they reached the house, Nate surprised Hannah by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. She protested weakly about his leg, but he silenced her concerns with a kiss. "I'm stronger than I look, remember," he reminded her with a grin. "Besides, I've been practicing." Inside, Hannah gasped in delight. While she had been involved in every aspect of preparing the house, Nate had insisted on handling the final touches himself. Now she saw why. The main parlor was lit with dozens of candles, casting a warm glow over the simple but comfortable furniture. A small table was set with their new dishes and a bottle of wine, a wedding gift from Dr. Wilson. "Oh, Nate," she breathed, taking in the scene. "It's perfect." Nate set her down gently, watching her face as she explored their new home. The pride in her expression as she ran her fingers over the polished woodwork, the curtains she had sewn herself, the colorful rag rugs they had purchased from a local woman, it all confirmed that they had made the right choice. "I know it's not as grand as what you might have had in Denver," he began. Hannah turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "It's our home," she said simply. "That makes it grander than any place I can imagine." Later that night, as they lay together in their new bed, the sounds of the desert night filtering through the open window, Nate marveled at the turn his life had taken. 2 months ago, he had been a solitary drifter with little to look forward to beyond the next potential strike. Now he was a husband and a homeowner, with plans and dreams that extended far into the future. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah murmured sleepily, her head resting on his chest. "How lucky I am," Nate replied honestly. "That storm, that creek, they could have been a tragedy for both of us." Instead, they gave me the greatest gift of my life." Hannah raised herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "We saved each other, I think," she said softly. "You from the water and you from—" She trailed off. "From believing I was less than a whole man," Nate finished for her. "From thinking my worth was measured by the steadiness of my gait rather than the steadiness of my heart." Hannah kissed him tenderly. "Your heart is the strongest I've ever known," she whispered. "And it's mine now, as mine is yours." "Forever," Nate promised as he pulled her close once more. The Thornton boarding house opened its doors in early July, coinciding with an uptick in mining activity around chloride. Within weeks, all 4 of their rooms were occupied by respectable miners who appreciated the home-cooked meals and clean, comfortable accommodations that were a far cry from the bunkhouses many were accustomed to. Hannah proved to be an excellent hostess and manager, keeping the house running smoothly while also offering evening lessons to the children of miners, both boarders and others from the town. The small fee she charged for these lessons added to their income and fulfilled her desire to teach. Nate, meanwhile, found his skills in demand around town. His experience as a deputy made him valuable to Chloride's overworked sheriff during the occasional disturbance. His knowledge of horses earned him regular work at the livery stable, helping to train and care for the animals. And his prospecting background made him a sought-after advisor for newcomers to the area. As summer turned to fall, and their first Christmas as a married couple approached, the Thorntons found themselves not just accepted, but integral to Chloride's small community. Their boarding house had become a gathering place for respectable citizens, and Sunday dinners at the Thornton table were coveted invitations. One crisp December evening, as Hannah and Nate sat before the fire in their parlor after the boarders had retired, Hannah set aside her mending with an expression Nate had come to recognize as her "I have news" face. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his whittling. He was crafting a set of chess pieces as a Christmas gift for one of their boarders. Hannah's smile was both shy and radiant. "I visited Dr. Wilson today," she said, "to confirm what I've suspected for a few weeks now." Nate's heart skipped a beat. "Are you?" "With child," Hannah confirmed, her hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Due in early summer, he thinks." Nate was across the room in an instant, his cane forgotten as he knelt before his wife and placed his hand reverently over hers. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, though his expression surely told her everything she needed to know. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Nate assured her, tears pricking at his eyes. "I love you so much, Hannah Thornton." "And I love you," she replied, pulling him up to sit beside her on the sofa. "I keep thinking about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't been on that trail during that storm, if you hadn't seen the wagon." "I try not to think about that," Nate admitted, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "The idea of never knowing you, never having this life we've built, it's unbearable." Hannah leaned into his embrace. "Then we won't think about it," she decided. "We'll focus instead on how fortunate we are, and on the future we're building now with a new little Thornton on the way." As they sat together planning and dreaming, the fire casting a golden glow over their faces, Nate reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought him to this moment. A thunderstorm, a swollen creek, a woman in distress, ordinary events that had combined to create an extraordinary life. His leg would always pain him, especially in cold weather or after a long day's work. He would always walk with a limp, would always need his cane for stability. But these facts no longer defined him or limited what he believed possible. In Hannah's eyes and now in his own, he was simply Nathaniel Thornton, husband, homeowner, respected member of the community, and soon father. As winter settled over Chloride, bringing occasional snow to the high desert and gathering the townspeople close to their hearths, the Thorntons' home remained warm and bright, a beacon of the love that had begun with an act of courage on a stormy spring evening. Their first child, a son they named William after Hannah's father, was born on a warm June day in 1885, almost exactly 1 year after they had met. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin, and from his first lusty cry, he had both his parents wrapped around his tiny fingers. The boarding house continued to thrive, expanding 2 years later when they purchased the adjacent property and added 3 more rooms. Hannah's informal lessons grew into a proper school as more families settled in the area, eventually leading to her appointment as Chloride's first schoolmistress, with a real schoolhouse built by community subscription. Nate's various endeavors prospered as well. Though he never found the mother lode he'd once dreamed of, he discovered something far more valuable in the life he and Hannah created together. His reputation for fairness and hard work earned him a place on the town council, where he advocated tirelessly for improvements that would benefit all of Chloride's citizens, not just the mine owners. Their family grew again 3 years after William's birth, with the arrival of twin girls, Elizabeth and Catherine, who brought both joy and delightful chaos to the Thornton household. The boarding house became somewhat less formal with children underfoot, but the boarders, many of whom had become long-term residents, didn't seem to mind. If anything, the family atmosphere made the place even more appealing to men far from their own homes. As the years passed, the story of how Nate and Hannah met became something of a local legend, embellished with each telling until the creek grew to a raging river, and Nate's rescue became ever more heroic. They let the townsfolk have their romantic tale, sharing secret smiles when it was recounted at gatherings. The truth, they knew, was romantic enough: a man with a wounded body but an unbroken spirit, a woman who saw strength where others saw weakness, and the courage it took for both to recognize that sometimes rescue comes in unexpected forms. On their 10th wedding anniversary, with their children tucked into bed and their home quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Nate presented Hannah with a gift he had been working on secretly for months: a finely crafted wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "It's beautiful," Hannah said, tracing the inlay with her finger. "Open it," Nate urged, an unusual nervousness in his voice. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket. When Hannah opened it, she found a tiny painting on one side, a remarkable likeness of the creek where they had met, rendered by an artist in Prescott from Nate's description. On the other side was an inscription: "You're the strongest man I've ever known." Hannah's eyes filled with tears as she read the words she had spoken so long ago. "You remembered," she whispered. "I'll never forget," Nate promised, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. "Those words changed everything for me." Hannah touched the locket reverently. "And you changed everything for me," she said, "by seeing me not as a burden or a responsibility after the accident, but as a woman worthy of respect and eventually love." "The worthiest woman I've ever known," Nate corrected her with a smile. "And the best decision I ever made was jumping into that creek after you." As they sat together on the sofa that had witnessed so many of their quiet evenings, the home they had built surrounding them with comfort and memories, both reflected on how far they had come from that stormy day in 1884. The journey hadn't always been easy. There had been lean times, illnesses, disagreements, and all the other challenges that come with building a life together. But through it all, they had held fast to each other, drawing strength from the bond that began with an act of courage and blossomed into a love story that would be told in chloride for generations to come. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, gentle and life-giving, so different from the threatening storm of their first meeting. Hannah rested her head on Nate's shoulder, and he held her close, grateful beyond words for the creek that had nearly taken her life, but had instead given them both a future neither could have imagined alone. "I love you, Nathaniel Thornton," Hannah murmured, her voice carrying the same warmth and conviction it had on the day they wed. "And I love you, Hannah Thornton," Nate replied, kissing her softly as the rain continued its gentle rhythm on the roof of the home they had built together, a testament to the truth they had discovered on that fateful day. That strength comes in many forms, but none so powerful as love.